Croeso, welcome. My name is Russell Todd, one of the founders with Tim Hartley of the football social enterprise Expo'r Wal Goch, Expo of the Red Wall, the Red Wall being the term coined by the male players of the Welsh national team for the supporters in the stand who follow them home and away. We're going to be talking about Ron Berry, the Rhondda author, born in 1920 at the very far end, northern end of the Rhondda Fawr, and who died almost a quarter of a century ago in 1997, and for whom sport was a central theme in a lot of his novels, his short stories, but also the heritage of sport, the collective memory of sport, and as well as the participation, not only in his fiction, but in some of his autobiographical and reflective writing, and also where they sort of blur a little bit as well. Grateful for the support from Sporting Heritage, a community interest company who is curating and leading on the curation of the Art of Sporting Heritage Month, and you can find more out about them at www.sportingheritage.org.uk. Literature Wales, llenyddiaeth Cymru, and also Parthian Books, who are supporting this as a sponsor. Parthian Books was founded in 1993, and as well as publishing the first novels by the likes of young, talented Welsh writers like Richard Owain Roberts and Alice Conran, also collaborates with the Rhys Davies Trust, with whom Daryl is involved, publishing books on recent Welsh history, but also major works of biography. Most familiarly, people probably will be aware of their work as publishing the Library of Wales series, a series of reissues and republications of some of the classic, seminal, important texts in Welsh writing, in the English language at least, and the first of which was So Long Hector Beb, Ron Berry's 1970 novel that centres very much around the boxing world with the titular character Hector Beb. The foreword to that was written by the author Niall Griffiths, in which he described the book as terrifying, but nevertheless one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. So I'm joined by Doctors Sarah Morse and Daryl Leeworthy, welcome, who have written extensively on Ron Berry, and we're going to talk a little bit about the role of sport and sporting heritage within his work. Sarah, so you've recently co-edited with Dr Georgia Burdett, Fight and Flight, essays on Ron Berry. It was published to coincide with his centenary in 2020. Other things in the world happened in 2020 that sort of put a bit of a kibosh on that. What's your connection then with Ron?
I first learnt about Ron Berry at the launch, actually, of the Library of Wales series at the Hay Festival in 2005, I think it was. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of Ron Berry. Niall Griffiths was there, he was invited because he'd written the foreword, and he just outlined this novel, and I thought, I need to read it. Hector Beb was my gateway to Ron Berry and the world of his Rhondda.
But that word terrifying that Niall uses to describe it, it's a very visceral book, isn't it?
It is.
That's a hell of an introduction.
Yeah, it was the first bit of Ron that I had read, but I do advise people to not maybe start with that novel, because it is brutal, not only in depictions of the boxing, but the other aspects of violence that are featured in the novel. There's a few scenes of animal abuse, there's violence against women in certain aspects of it. It's a really complex novel. It's also structurally a very literary novel. There are 53 chapters and 12 different voices. There's an awful lot to keep in your head. It'll make a great film one day. I'm adamant of that, and somebody really needs to make a film of it. But it is quite a ride. It is quite a journey.
And it's not just a rich vernacular of the Rhondda, but also of boxing and some of the terminology that you come to use, but also the way in which there's almost speech impediments caused by either wearing gum shields or just the physical kind of abuse that the boxers have taken. Daryl Leeworthy, you've contributed one of the essays to the Fight and Flight book, but written about Ron and other authors as well. You're with the Rhys Davies Trust. What do people need to know about you?
Grown up in end of the valley kind of place like Ron, but not quite as bleak as Blaencombe, and gone up to Oxford and was like, well, no one is like me in this place. In an Oxford college, no one is sounds like me, no one thinks like me, and certainly no one reads the stuff that I'm trying to find. So I went into the library to try and find material which spoke about home, and I happened across the three writers that have kind of stuck with me ever since. Gwyn Thomas, Rhys Davies, and Ron Berry, in that order. The thing I found of Ron's work was not Hector Bebb or any of the novels. It was History is What You Live, his autobiography, which for me was the best introduction, because there is someone talking about the world that I knew, but also the decay that I understood from childhood as well, because he's trying to explain why that valley, his valley, which ultimately became the valleys in a broader sense, wasn't like it was when he was born almost a century before. Well, more than a century in our case now, but at that time, and trying to understand both the life and the decay, and why those two things happened in the way that they did.
But he was a very sporty individual himself, wasn't he? I mean, the number of sports that get referenced, for example, in History is What You Live, are numerous. He writes about others as well. You know, he worked as a sort of swimming pool sort of warden or an attendant as well, lifeguard. But when he talks about a lot of these sports and his pursuit in them, I mean, notwithstanding as well the knee injury he suffered as a footballer, and he was a talented footballer, which we'll come on to. There's a lot of detail around his enjoyment in sport. For example, the making of his bicycles, for example, but the way he would flog himself on these, you know, hugely, long distance cycle rides with, is it the Pentre Clarion Cycling Club, which resonated with me because Pentre is also where Jimmy Murphy was born, who was manager of Wales in the 1958 World Cup. And that sense of sport as something not just to enjoy, but to push yourself in doing as well, in a very physical, well, mental as well, I suppose, but certainly a very physical way.
Well, the obvious way of putting it is that sport is what you live. In Ron's case, that was very much what he did live. He played it, but he also made it at the same time. So he was there. You read the stuff about having to pick out the stones from the awful football pitch at the back end of the Rhondda, going through the Blancombe Tunnel, to play teams on the other side of the mountain. Possible in those days, maybe in the near future, people will be able to do that journey once again, but cycle rather than catch the train, which is quite appropriate for Ron, cycling through. And having the techniques to be able to put that material together, put his bicycles together, put the bars on his boots, as he's shown by his dad how to do, and put the studs into the boots as well. It's a very technical skill. And I think that's really the essence of Ron, is that sport is not just something to sit in front of the telly and watch, because in those days that was not possible. It is something that you literally live and work at. And it's the skill of work that he's reminding people is involved in those sports that he is presenting us. And that's why there's that viscerality to Hector Bebb, because this is someone who is a working boxer. He's not just the fictional version of a boxer. He's not Rocky Balboa just running around Philadelphia and doing his things. This is someone who really does have to train at it, does have to take the beatings, does have to live with the bruises that come afterwards. And therefore, he is brutalized by the work that he's doing. And that's a broader theme in Ron's work there.
For Ron, sport was also escapism to a certain extent, the freedom he had on his bike, the distances he could cover, and it is touched on in History is What You Live, where he recalls one Sunday afternoon deciding that he's going to cycle to Bristol, I think it is, or Weston-super-Mare, somewhere in the West Country. He's just going to hop on his bike and cycle there. There was no M4. So he admits that he was nearly blind through the exertion, but he'd had an afternoon of freedom. He'd been away. He hadn't been, he wasn't underground. He was off doing things, and he was able to go places. And so that's also something that sport was this other world.
So Expo'r Wal Goch, as I said, is a football social enterprise. So to come to his footballing credentials, he played for Swansea Town during the Second World War. He played alongside the great, who came to be great, Trevor Ford, who played on leave from the Navy, I think it was. He also played sort of more locally, so Blind Rhondda, AFC, I think Fernhill as well. And my first introduction to Ron was Flame and Slag, but then it was also in the Parthian Compendium of Sport, the chapter that I think is lifted from Full-Time Amateur about the Rhondda Derby. And it's just this wonderful kind of writing. So his football, I mean, what else do we need to know about his footballing career?
It's the injury that he receives from that which creates his lifelong disability. rugby in school, soccer on Saturday. Soccer is the freedom that you get when you're not under some kind of institution. So we use his word there very much. And it's the soccer that he's playing, which is following on from his dad. His dad had been a soccer player too. Yes, that gives him some kind of ancestral inheritance, which is something that he's very much a believer of. But soccer is also his camaraderie, his maintaining the bonds built underground when he is underground, and bonds in other ways as well. And it is the means of being countercultural, actually. This is the thing about Ron, is that he's always looking for the way out of the mainstream. And soccer in those days was a way out of the mainstream. So you have, yes, in the early 1920s, when Ron is very young, the fading mid-Rhondda Mushrooms, mid-Rhondda FC, who'd been in the Southern League, who'd been quite a good side, actually. All of those clubs, like Merthyr Town, like Pontypridd, to a lesser extent, like Avid, and mid-Rhondda and Tom Pentre as well, who were the great rivals in the Rhondda Fawr, they were all in decline in the 1920s. Because the context in which those clubs had been formed, to the most part, which had been the split in rugby, in the early years of the 20th century in Wales, following on from the creation of the Northern Union in Yorkshire and Lancashire in 1895, suddenly you've got professional sport, people being played and paid at the same time, different ways. To play, that gives people a chance of escaping from something, yes, but it also gives them a lot of hope, people to have, put your heroes in. Then suddenly those heroes are going back up north. They're going to Bristol, they're going to London, they're going to Newcastle, wherever it might be, to play the sport again. Soccer is on the decline. It's not the aspirational sport that it once was in the, from about 1905 to 1920 or so. Ron comes in just as that's declining. And there's always that sense in his work that he's born just too late to really get the boom. He's got the bust, and that makes him really angry about it. And so he still sees in the soccer, that's why he goes to try and play for Swansea Town, and there's the descriptions in his work in Full-Time Amateur and in History's What You Live about going for those trials, getting the places in the teams, hopefully making it, and making that escape from this place, but still being rooted in that place because it's something that earlier generations have done as well. So it's that boom, it's that boom to bust, and Ron being the bust and his dad having had the boom years, which I think really haunts him quite a lot.
Because he's quite anti-authoritarian, isn't he? Well, very anti-authoritarian.
Yes. He got into a few scrapes, shall we say? Yeah,
but one of them, when he gets, and to be fair, Blind Rhondda AFC, pay for the treatment, he doesn't seem to think much of the physician, shall we say, the doctor that he sent to try and sort his knee out.
No, he doesn't like that kind of authority. No, it's the imbalance of the relationship, isn't it? I think it's why I think also why he's very interested in writing more about women, because they're on the imbalance of the relationship. Everything else is about men. So I'm going to write about the people who were hard done by, the folks who are on the other side of this story.
And it's there as well in how he writes about the environment and landscape too, because it's other. Yeah. It's the unexpected. But if anybody's visited Blaencombe, you understand why he wrote what he wrote, because it's such a place apart. You're surrounded by mountains on all sides in this little bowl, and he's spending as much time up on those hills. And that brings a different perspective, as you see in History's What You Live. It's not a biography where it's basically a guided walk. He's walking you through history, through time, through a landscape, and guiding you round his milltir sgwâr. Yeah. And imbuing and passing on that knowledge to other people, because he was really conscious of his inheritance, be it, from boom to bust, but also he knows of the good days. He knows what was there, and he knows what still remains. And so it's getting his head around that and sharing it with future generations.
And what I know about birds and bird watching is practically nil. But Peregrine Watching, I enjoyed that book far much more than I was expecting. But he writes about the birds in some of the ways he writes about the boxers or the footballers. There's a physicality to these birds, but this sense of awe and majesty to them as well, that he probably doesn't, he holds even more for the birds than he does for athletes as well, perhaps. But a really peculiar book in some ways, and I don't mean that as a criticism. It shouldn't be as readable as it is in some respects.
It's a slim little volume, and it's currently sadly out of print. It's part of a tradition of ornithological non-fiction writing, but it's very distinct from the most famous one, which was The Peregrine by J.A. Baker. He rallies against the anthropomorphism. He doesn't want people to see animals like people. And that's a recurring theme in lots of his environmental writing. Like, no, they are different. He sees that animals and humans are part of the same thing, but that we shouldn't need to put human qualities onto animals to respect them. That this is the Anthropocene. We've got to get through this together. He saw the big picture. And he definitely anticipated this shift to, or what is now seen as a contemporary shift to environmental thinking. It was there in the 70s and the 80s and before.
But like you said with Hector Bebb, there's brutality in there as well, isn't there? And it figures in his short stories. Now, the extent to which fox hunting, badger baiting are sports, blood sports, whatever, could be debatable. But that viscerality comes through quite a lot as well. So it wasn't putting things up on a pedestal entirely.
In one of Ron's stories, he writes about how there's a conversation between two miners, and I think they've been stealing eggs and shooting birds of prey. And one asks the other, what will happen when the last peregrine goes? They're basically, it'll be gone. But that wasn't Ron, because Ron would know what would happen when the last peregrine went. And so he's writing against an underlying culture as well, is that he understands the majesty and the glory and the importance of these raptors. But he understands how they're seen as prizes, game trophies basically by other people. And he's challenging that behaviour. And that's a theme through it. But I think it's all about taking care. And I think that's how it's very interesting that he also writes about pigeons and racing pigeons. And the short story Time Spent is just an absolutely devastating short story. It's about loss, it's about disability, it's about where do you go when the world that you know is no longer open to you. And Ron does it through tangentially looking at sport.
Incredible short story, that one. That's probably my pick. You don't really want to call it my favourite, but yeah, it would be my pick.
Ron is writing those short stories mostly in the 80s and early 90s. They're being published, certainly. Some of them are written before that. And he's writing in a way which is trying to capture, as he called it in his last novel, this bygone age, this loss, this decay that he's trying to get to grips with, but also to show that it's not just all bleak. There are these bits of gold dust flaked all the way through. And he uses, I think, pigeon racing in those older traditions, which were very, very popular, all the way through until the decline of mining, and then are sort of left as hangovers from that, to show those flakes of gold dust without falling into kind of romanticism or Celticism. I think Celtic fairy dust sometimes you get, which is, we'll have a nice Eisteddfod this time. No, we're going to have pigeon racing because that's much more realistic to this world. The Eisteddfod is the world of the 1890s when my parents were little. This is the world that I knew when I was younger, that older men would have been talking about as well. I think that's how he gets out of the trap that he always felt that someone like Gwyn Thomas and Elaine Morgan had fallen into. They'd fallen into a kind of more operatic version of the Valley story.
He's almost writing against that "how green is my valley" tradition. And you do wonder, given when Elaine Morgan's adaptation went out on BBC, he's kind of writing against that sentimentality. And he's kind of said, well, that's one take, and that's the take that people want to hear. that everything was good and we had these massive joints of roast beef and everything was brilliant and mining was hard but men were good but we got through it. And he's saying, no, it wasn't. There were good bits, there were bad bits, and mining is bloody hard work. It's and that's the brutality. That's what comes through in all of his work, be it writing about sport, boxing, working underground. It's the absolute brutality of mining. He describes it as being up there with deep sea fishing because it's an engagement with the earth and the ever-present danger that was out of their control. You are basically wrestling with the earth and there's no way you're going to come out of it as a winner.
To what extent is, because a lot of people outside of Wales would identify Wales with rugby union, and the Six Nations is on as we're recording. Rugby barely features in his works, really. So I find that sort of interesting. But then there's also this sense, we mentioned McCarthy, Cormac McCarthy, this concept of American Wales. Is that why boxing is so prominent?
It's the money that they got. I think this is the thing. All of the other sports that are coming up and popping up in the valleys in the 20s and 30s, greyhound racing, speedway, they tried ice hockey but didn't quite work because there weren't enough Canadians willing to come to Cardiff or to Tonopandi in those days. They tried those things and those had some kind of resonance because if you could ride a motorcycle, you could earn a fiver. Now that doesn't sound like a lot to us, but when nobody else has got a shilling or a penny, let alone a fiver in 1935, that's what you're going to go for. That's your way out. That's your American dream, if you like. I can work my way out of poverty by doing the thing that I'm good at.
I think it's there in Hector Webb, though. Hector is a heroic character. And it comes back to that idea of he is using his physical capital to earn money. Because by day, he's a drayman. He's got a physical job. He's lugging barrels around the place. And then he spends his time in the gym. And it's the only thing that Hector has available to him is his body. That's the only thing he can make money from. And he's good. He's disciplined. And he fights like nobody they've ever seen before. And there's this idea that it's the thin line between being under control and losing control. And that's what the whole of that novel negotiates. It's that idea of, I think he describes a trained animal by one of the wives in the novel. Because he intimidates people. But they're also enthralled with him because of his stature, because of how he handles. So he's a gladiator. But he also, throughout the novel, I think it's this way of, it's as much about boxing, but it's also about the society. And it's unpicking the fact that it's not just Hector who's negotiating the line between what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. Everybody is. In their own different ways, and how they negotiate that. And that he's more visible because of, he has a suspension because of behaviour in the ring, doesn't he? And he's returning from that. And then the act of violence that makes him go on the run happens outside of the ring after a huge victory. So he's a really, really visible totem almost of what can happen when you lose control or when you just cross that line. But all the other characters are trying to find which side of the line do you actually want to be on.
Yeah, it's the two deaths that are in there. One death is in the ring, one death is outside of the ring. Which one is the acceptable one, which isn't? Yeah. It comes back to, you can tell he's a historian of boxing as well as a writer about boxing, because that's something that someone who you don't associate with boxing at all, George Bernard Shaw, was writing about at the beginning of the 20th century. Bernard Shaw had written one of his novels is a boxing novel. And in 1900 or so, it's re-released. He writes a foreword or an afterword, I forget exactly where in the book it's placed. And he says, society hates fighting. So if there's a fight in the street, the first people you call are the police to try and put it up. But we've invented this thing called prize fighting. And in there, it's absolutely acceptable to fight because there is a boundary. And that's the dynamic that Ron is getting at. It's like everybody in this context is brutalized. Everyone is stuck with this brutality. You don't forget what you've just seen when someone's being punched in the face by someone stronger. You carry that with you. You are affected by that as well. So is there any difference between the death that happens in the ring, which causes a suspension, wow, and the death outside the ring, which causes the flight? Ron leaves it up to the reader to decide that, but you know what his answer is. You know that there is an affirmative answer that Ron is saying, well, there's no difference between these two. You have to get over that to be able to understand why someone like Hector Bebb would be a hero, why someone like Tommy Farr would be a hero. Well, Tommy Farr never killed anyone in a ring or outside, but why they would be a hero, because they're such a brutal figure. They are a heroic, brutal figure. And I think that's interesting.
Traditionally, you wouldn't have heard from boxers. You'd have heard from promoters. You'd have heard from... They weren't there to speak. They were there to fight. Nobody would ever hear their side. But here is a novel which is predominantly from the boxer's perspective. And we're more used to it now, you know, with documentaries and interviews with boxers and it's not quite an industry, but you get the boxer's perspective and how they have approached it, the psychology of it, how they've understood it. Just so for this in 1970 was groundbreaking. And although it's a ventriloquization because it's not an actual boxer, but to even seek to try to capture that voice is really important.
Sarah, you said at the start that it's one of the best novels, Welsh novels, I think you said. Niall Griffith says one of the best of the 20th century, full stop. If I was to press you for maybe a particular one, if people listen to this and think, okay, well, I'm minded to start with Hector Bebb because you've talked a lot about it, but it's also terrifying, as Niall said, and has that viscerality to it. If they were minded maybe to start elsewhere, where would you suggest?
I'd say start with Flame and Slag. It's about a miner coming to terms with the decline of mining, the changing role of women in the Rhondda, disability, injury, and also it's sort of a response to the Aberfan disaster because Ron was working on the novel in 1966, and it does feature a tip slide. But it's an attempt to write about that awful experience and how you come to terms with it. But yeah, start with Flame and Slag. There's a lot in it, and then work your way into Hector Bebb because I think Hector Bebb I think is if you've never encountered Ron Berry before, it's a lot to take in. Flame and Slag is a good introduction.
Yeah. That's where I started. Daryl?
Well, I have two because I can never make a choice between them. Okay. The first is Full-Time Amateur. It's the South Walian version of This Sporting Life, or The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, or Saturday Night, Sunday Morning. It is that angry young man novel, perfectly pitched to understand what the heck a young person does in the early 60s when the world his parents knew and took for granted has gone, and the world his grandparents knew and took for granted has gone. And that anger, that fury, that frustration spills out in that character. And the reason I say I have two is because thinking with my historian's hat on, and actually the other side of that story is History is What You Live. And you cannot read your way through Ron without ever reading that book as well. Because it is probably the finest autobiography of any Welsh writer ever. It is perfectly pitched. It has everything in it and does, in about 200 pages, what historians have spent decades and decades trying to fit into hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. And some of the lists in there are just eye-watering in a really emotive sense. There are some of the lists where he talks about his friends that he worked with. It gives their name. Then it says dust, dead, dying, disabled, dying, disabled, dead. It's just morose poetry, but it is poetry. I think that's why sometimes people think of Ron as a poet, because his writing has poetic elements to it.
And that list practically fills a page,
Yes,
isn't it?
yes.
And I will go back for every now and again. I've got that page marked, and it's incredible.
It's an elegy, basically.
Yeah.
It's an elegy on a page for
Yeah.
a people, a place, and a community that Ron knew, which is also universal.
Well, I'm going to throw in then time spent then, that short story, because as I said, that's my pick. I don't want to call it my favourite because it is quite harrowing and deeply tragic, but just incredibly powerful. So we've got his autobiography, we've got 2 of his long-form novels, and there's one of his short stories, but is a rich body of work there as well as plays, of course, as well. His family have maintained a website, obviously deeply proud of his achievements and his work. Is that ronberry.co.uk, I think? So you can obviously find more about the Parthian series, the Library of Wales series, and some of its Modern Wales series that Daryl is published on as well, I think, and the biography, and you mentioned Elaine Morgan as well.
Yes, the biography of Gwyn Thomas is out in a couple of months, actually.
So that's at the Parthian's website, which is easily found. Sporting Heritage, as I said, www.sportingheritage.org.uk for the Art of Sporting Heritage Month on all forms of social media, all platforms, #sport&art. There's also some Welsh language content, chwaraeon a chelf as well, that hashtag, but there's more in the English. And as far as Expo'r Wal Goch is concerned, please look at some of the other videos that we've got from our inaugural online expo celebrating all aspects of Welsh fan culture to do with poetry and fanzines, the heritage of the game, looking at some of the experiences of women, supporting Wales, and as increasingly inclusive as people tend to recognise and celebrate supporting Wales is, there's still a long way to go, as the work of Dr Penny Miles demonstrates as part of as that expo last year. So all of those videos are on our YouTube channel along with this. Diolch yn fawr, thank you very much to you both. I've learned a massive amount. There's a couple of books that I'm going to try and get my hands on before you leave, not least the first editions of those, which I'd never seen the So Long Hector Beb cover at all, not even on the internet. Obviously, I'd seen the Travelling Loaded one. And the Fight and Flight book is out on University of Wales Press. Anything else you want to say about that?
We didn't really have a chance to do much with it in 2020, but it's accessible. It's not an intimidating academic text, although it does have footnotes. Hopefully it's accessible, and hopefully it'll help people to navigate their way through Ron's work.
Yeah, and there's your chapter in here as well, isn't there? Full-time amateur sport in Ron Berry's South Walian imagination, which goes into lots of these themes in a bit more detail. Both of you, I'm very grateful. Thank you.